Appreciate that song. Appreciate the ladies. Wonderful job they did. Amen. I will confess to you before I come up here, went over there to take my spot, walked up and leaned over to Debbie Stevens and said, I actually threatened the quartet. I said, I'm singing with you guys tonight. And very wisely, that idea was vetoed, so you have them to thank for that. But anyway, excellent job. Enjoy that. Appreciate it. If you would take your Bibles tonight, turn please to the book of 2 Kings chapter 5. Second Kings chapter 5. I don't always put titles on messages. I'm actually going to give you a title just to kind of set the stage. If you were to give this message a title, I would call it One Bad Decision, One Lifetime of Consequences. And in chapter 5, we're actually going to be dealing with three main characters, one of which you actually, Brother Joe, coincidentally or not, the Holy Spirit tends to work this way. Brother Joe kind of gave us the lead in as we're going to be looking at three individuals. The first one starting in chapter 1. It says, Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master, and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man in valor, but he was a leper. That verse tells us a lot, and obviously what Brother Joe talked about this morning, he talked about the uncleanness of leprosy. Primary focus in terms of Naaman's character this morning was the uncleanness of leprosy. We're given more information in verse 1. We know that he was the general of the army of the Syrians. We know that he was a great warrior. He was a brave warrior. The king of Syria thought the world of him. The people loved him. You know, all these things you can derive from those adjectives that we see there in verse 1. You go through that verse, and it really sounds like a lot of people that we would know today. We know a lot of people in our world today that are highly regarded by the world. They have positions of power. They have positions of influence. They have money. They have fame. They have admiration. But yet they still carry around this uncleanness of sin. That's how Naaman reads here as we're introduced to him in verse 1. You go through this list, and it's this, and it's this, and it's this. And then you see that one word there in chapter 5, verse 1. It's the word, especially in my Sunday school class, you'll recognize what I'm about to say. If you've ever heard me preach more than once, you've probably heard me say this. You see the word but, which I always refer to as the game changer. You see this big, long list of how great Naaman was. We're told that he was the general, the host of the army of the king of Syria. At some point in time, and the Bible never gives us any specifics about this, but at some point in time, God had some kind of connection with Naaman because God had used him to deliver the Syrians out of some type of battle scenario. We don't have any more background. The Bible never mentions Naaman prior to this. Don't really know what that reference is about. But because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria, he had all these accolades. Then you get to the but. Oh yeah, by the way, you know, this guy was a great guy, great general, etc. But by the way, he was also a leper. Bible never tells us exactly why he had this uncleanness of leprosy. This is going to be one of those portions where I kind of give you my own theory and philosophy, and it may be right, may not be right, whatever. I don't know. But here's my theory in terms of what's behind the leprosy. If you remember in the book of Acts, you remember Herod Agrippa. You remember he was up there giving this great speech, this great oration. The people loved it, and they cheered, and they applauded, and they said, it's as the voice of a god. And then what happened to Herod Agrippa? Falls down dead, devoured by worms. Why? In essence, because he did not give God his glory. Naaman, you see that God used him to deliver Syria. Again, without specific details, I'm filling in blanks here. I'm making guesses. But I'm going to guess that Naaman probably either didn't recognize the hand of the Lord behind the victories and the deliverance, or he didn't acknowledge it. Therefore, this potentially could have been a punishment for not doing that. That's just a theory. Either way, he's got this issue of uncleanness. We go through chapter 5. The king of Syria loves this guy. I mean, virtually would do anything apparently in the world for Naaman, trusted general, so much so that he sends messenger, king of Israel, says, hey, can you help cleanse him? Remember at this time, the king of Israel was Jehoram. He was the son of Ahab. Ahab, probably the most wicked king in the history of all of Israel. All of the kings of Israel were wicked. But because Jehoram was an Israelite, the king of Syria probably assumed that he knew the Lord, probably assumed that he could intercede on behalf of Naaman and help bring about a deliverance. The king of Israel, Jehoram, verse 7 says, "And it came to pass, when the king of Israel had read the letter, that he rent his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man doth send unto me to recover a man of his leprosy? Wherefore consider, I pray you, and see how he seeketh a quarrel against me." So Jehoram kind of gives a little indictment against himself here. He recognizes he does not have the spiritual ability to intercede on behalf of Naaman. He doesn't come out and say that, but Jehoram, of course, being the son of Ahab, Jezebel, his mother, most wicked woman probably listed in the entire Bible, deep into false religions, deep into idolatry, deep into Baal worship. Jehoram did not have the spiritual condition, did not have the spiritual presence or relationship with God that he could do anything for Naaman. And in fact, Jehoram even goes so far as to suspect the king of Syria is trying to set him up. King of Syria should know I can't do that. I'm not going to be able to do it. He's going to use that as an excuse to attack us. That's what he's thinking in all of this. The second character that we're introduced to here, verse 8, it says, "And it was so when Elijah the man of God had heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, Wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him come now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." Elisha is one of the greatest prophets in the entire Old Testament. Very thumbnail, real quick little sketch about who Elisha was. You go back to 1 Kings, I believe it's chapter 19, where he's taken under the wings, becomes the protege of another person you may have heard of, whose name was Elijah. Bible never comes out and says this. My personal opinion, I think Elijah is probably considered the greatest of all the Old Testament prophets, because Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, go down the list. Elijah was the only one that was translated and never actually saw or felt the sting of death. That's why I believe he wasn't perfect. He had his issues. You study his life and his ministry. None of us are perfect. But he probably was the most faithful of all the Old Testament prophets. And Elisha was his protege. Don't literally go back here, but if you want to later, you can go back into 2 Kings chapter 2. As Elijah is getting prepared to leave, he's being prepared to be translated off the earth, be taken into heaven, Elisha has such a heart that he asks that God gives to him a double portion of the spirit of righteousness that Elijah had. And he received that. And if you actually do a character study, you go through the 1 Kings, 2 Kings, you study Elisha's life, he's a phenomenal prophet. There's nothing really else that you can say about the man. Very faithful, very powerful, very bold, does exactly what God wants him to do when he wants him to do it. Tremendously strong voice in a wicked nation. He even says that at the end of that verse. He says, "Go tell them to send him to me so that he knows there is at least one righteous person in Israel that can help him out." So, kind of fast forwarding through portions of the story, Naaman goes to Elisha. Elisha doesn't actually come out and talk to him. He sends a messenger out. Through the messenger, Elisha gives him the directions to be cleansed and purified. Just like you and I, when we sit down, we talk to somebody, we witness to somebody, hopefully you're able to give them the directions on how to be cleansed from their sin. Know they have a home in heaven. The path is very clear. Realize you're a sinner. Trust that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, come in the flesh, sinless life, died, rose again, sacrificed for our sin. You put your faith and trust in that, you know you have a home in heaven. Elisha gives, through his messenger, very simple yet distinct instructions to Naaman. Go to the Jordan River, dip yourself 7 times, and you notice how it says there, verse 10, Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, Go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. Those shouts, by the way, are very important. Those are faith promises. Naaman, if you have the faith to obey God's path to righteousness, you will be made clean. Just like the Bible tells us, if you believe with your heart, if you confess with your tongue that Jesus Christ is Lord, you shall be saved. And God is a God of righteousness who can never go back on these promises. And Naaman does what a lot of people do. They hear the path of righteousness. It doesn't necessarily make sense to them. You see there in verse 11, Naaman does not respond with happiness or glee or joy. I mean, quite frankly, I would be pretty happy with this. Doesn't sound like a very hard thing to do. You go to Jordan, you dip yourself 7 times, and this terrible uncleanness will be washed away, and I will be brand new. Simple enough, right? We know that the simplicity of the gospel is oftentimes the major stumbling block to a lot of people. It's like there's no way that if all I do is trust that Jesus Christ died for my sins, there's got to be more to it than that. And we work very hard as human beings to either create that way or to find that way, completely missing the point that you cannot do it on your own. Naaman, you cannot do it on your own. You have to have faith that if you obey in doing this, God will do what He has said He will do. Naaman was wroth. He goes away. His pride kicks in. There in verse 11, I like how he says this. He said, Behold, I thought he will surely come out to me, which first of all, that was the first issue. Elisha himself didn't even come out to him. Took that as a sign of disrespect. Pride's kicking in. Did not come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord as God and strike his hand over the place and recover the leper. Naaman had his own idea how he thought this should be cured. Man's ways are not God's ways, and God's ways are not man's ways. The gospel of Jesus Christ, God coming in the flesh, living a sinless life, dying as the ultimate sacrifice for my sins, makes no sense to me as a human being. I will confess that to you. But you know what? That's God's plan of salvation. And I don't have to understand it. I just have to trust in it. Naaman didn't have to agree with the methodology. He didn't have to understand why this would work. He just had to obey. But the pride kicked in. Fortunately for him, some of his servants got a hold of him, talked a little sense into him, talked him off the ledge, as they say. Naaman ultimately does what Elisha told him to do, goes to Jordan River, dips himself 7 times, and just as God had promised through Elisha, says in verse 14, the very last portion of that says, And his flesh came again, like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Should be no great surprise to anybody in this room, God delivered on his promise. Your righteous God will never fail on a promise. 100% batting average throughout the course of all ages. Verse 15. As a result of this, Naaman returns to Elisha. This time they actually meet up. Naaman offers him a reward. Appreciate what you did. Like to give you something in exchange. Verse 15, he actually even confesses that there is no God other than Jehovah. He says there in the middle of verse 15, Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant. Verse 16, Elisha responds, But he said, As the Lord liveth, before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Elisha wouldn't take any of the reward. We'll talk about why when we get to the end of this chapter. There is a very strong indication why he wouldn't take it. Naaman goes on his way. Now we're going to come across the third individual mentioned in this particular story. You go down to verse 20. We're told, by the way, back in chapter 4, that Elisha has a servant named Gehazi. Verse 20 says, and here's that word again, you know, this is that part, you're sitting in the movie's going in one direction, then something happens, and you're sitting here like, uh-oh, plot twist. Here's the plot twist. But Gehazi, the servant of Elijah, the man of God, said, Behold, my master hath spared Naaman the Syrian in not receiving at his hands that which he brought. But as the Lord liveth, I will run after him and take somewhat of him. We're going to read through the rest of these verses to the end of the chapter. We're going to see during the course of this, Gehazi actually ends up being guilty of 3 different sins compounded into one ultimate punishment we see at the very end. First sin that we see Gehazi engaging in, the very clear biblical command, Exodus chapter 20, I think verse 17, but don't hold me to that. Thou shalt not covet. Gehazi is a servant. We don't know anything else about him. We don't know how old he is. We don't know how long he's been Elisha's servant. We know that he is a servant to, at that point in time, because Elijah's been translated, probably one of the most, if not the most righteous man left on planet Earth. You know Elisha is taking care of him. He's not mistreating him. He's not starving him. He's not hurting for clothing. He's not hurting for shelter. But that spirit of covetousness gets into his heart. Just like it does when it gets into our hearts sometimes. That little seed, you remember James talking in chapter 1 of the book of James, that he's referring to the lust of the flesh, but it talks about how it gets in there like a little seed, and then it conceives, and it brings forth and produces sin, and so forth. Covetousness is the same way. You get your eyes on something, and you want it bad enough, and especially if you think there's an easy way that you can go about getting it, that consumes you. This servant, who has nothing to do with this story up to this point, we're not told that he was anywhere in the vicinity when Naaman went, dunked himself in the Jordan River, wasn't there, or at least we're never told that he was there. When he comes and offers, Naaman comes and offers Elijah the rewards, has nothing to do with any of this. Gehazi, you did nothing. But my master, it says, Behold, my master hath spared Naaman the Syrian in not receiving of his hands that which he brought. But as he liveth, as the Lord liveth, I will run after him and take somewhat of him. It doesn't take a whole lot. If we see that open door to sin, it doesn't take a whole lot to blow that door open and just bowl right through it. Gehazi knows that Naaman is a rich guy. We're not exactly told what all he offered to Elijah, but you can bet, especially as we get to a few verses down when we see what actually ends up happening, Naaman actually has a lot of possessions, a lot of items with him. General of an army, national hero, he's a rich guy. Here's Gehazi, he's this simple servant. What's it going to hurt if I take a little? Who's going to know? What's it going to matter? Which oftentimes is how sin breeds in our hearts. Gehazi, verse 21, says that, so Gehazi followed after Naaman, and when Naaman saw him running after him, he lighted down from the chariot to meet him and said, Is all well? And he said, All is well. My master hath sent me, saying, Behold, even now there be come to me from Mount Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Give them, I pray thee, a talent of silver and 2 changes of garments. So here we're introduced to the second sin of Gehazi. Covetousness oftentimes leads to sin. In this case, it leads to lying. He chases Naaman down. Naaman stops. Naaman asks him if there's anything wrong. Oh, no, everything's good. But even though I know my master told you he didn't want anything, and then he concocts this story, this lie to Naaman to get what he wants. And this is the truth with lying. We all probably know, hate to say it this way, if you have any experience in lying, and unfortunately we all do, oftentimes you never just stop at one lie. You have to continue to build lie upon lie upon lie. The first part of this lie, he doesn't come after Naaman and say, oh, by the way, I'm just a poor servant. Would you mind giving me the stuff? He blames it on Elisha. And then the second part of this lie, he concocts the details to make the lie seem plausible. He says that there become to me from Mount Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Give them, I pray thee, a talent of silver and 2 changes of garments. Naaman said, verse 23, be content, take 2 talents. And he urged him, which indicates to me that Gehazi is a little reluctant to take 2 talents. He asked for 1 talent, and I have a theory as to why he was a little reluctant to take 2 talents, but we'll get to there in a second. It says he urged him and bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of garments and laid them upon 2 of his servants, and they bare them before him. And when he came to the tower, he took them from their hand and bestowed them in the house, and he let the men go, and they departed. A talent, biblically speaking, is equal to about 75 pounds. 2 talents, do the math, 150 pounds. You take today's exchange rate, approximately $24.50 to $25 per ounce for an ounce of silver. Do the math, do the multiplications. 1 talent of silver worth approximately $30,000. Why would he ask for 1 and be hesitant to take 2? Because I don't know what form this silver would have been in. I don't know if it would have been silver coins. I don't know if it would have been silver bars. But it's a lot easier to hide 75 pounds of silver from your master than it is to hide 150. Again, that's just my theory. We're never told that. But you know how sin goes. Doesn't take a whole lot to twist the old arm and say, well, I asked you for 30,000, you're going to give me 60 grand, so okay, I'll take it. So big and so heavy and whatever all of this is, and of course 2 suits of clothes, which really in the grand scheme don't mean anything. 2 of Naaman's servants had to help him carry this stuff back to his quarters. It says there in verse 24, when he came to the tower, he took them from his hand, he bestowed them in the house. Where, I have no idea. Where you think you're going to get away with hiding 150 pounds of silver, no idea. Sin doesn't always think things through. Gehazi probably didn't think this out. And he let the men go, and they departed. Verse 25, but he went in and stood before his master. And Elisha said unto him, whence comest thou, Gehazi? And he said, thy servant went no whither. There's lie number 3. Remember I said, these sins, they keep snowballing. This is the one that I really don't understand. I know sin makes you do stupid things, and sin makes you make dumb decisions. There was a reason why I kind of gave you the brief little layout about who Elijah was, his background with Elijah, the double portion of the Spirit, probably, one of the most respected prophets of the Old Testament. If you think you're going to lie and get away with it to somebody, Elisha's not that guy. You can fool Naaman. Naaman may have gotten saved. He may not have. Nobody knows what's really in his heart when he confesses that Jehovah is the only true God. I can't tell you for sure if Naaman was saved. What I can tell you is he definitely didn't have the spiritual discernment to know that Gehazi was pulling one over on him. Elijah, however, verse 26. And he said unto him, went not mine heart with thee when the man turned again from his chariot to meet thee? Is it a time to receive money and to receive garments and oliveyards and vineyards and sheep and oxen and men servants and maid servants? Which, by the way, to me, that answers the question why Elijah wouldn't take it in the first place. You don't do the will of God and do good for other people for reward. One of the problems, I've heard Brother Wally ask this question, probably you've thought of this question. People on the street, when they criticize this type of stuff, they ask this type of a question. If Benny Hinn is such a great supposed faith healer, why is he not going into hospitals, children's hospitals, cancer wards, burn wards, and healing people for free? Right. Answer, because he's a fraud. Right. Be very wary of somebody that wants to charge you to do something nice for you. Elijah said this was not the time, that was not the occasion to take a reward. I was doing God's will. That's what God wanted me to do. And basically, Gehazi, you have tainted the whole process, which is one of the problems here. Gehazi didn't think that part through. It wasn't important to him. But basically, by lying and using Elijah's name, he was casting aspersions upon Elijah's motivations and Elijah's heart. He was casting aspersions and tainting the very work and miracle that God had wrought through Elisha. Gehazi didn't get that. And so he asks him this. And then verse 27, the last verse. Very simple pronouncement. The leprosy, therefore, of Naaman shall cleave unto thee, and unto thy seed forever. And he went out from his presence a leper as white as snow. And that's the real meat of what we're talking about tonight. This started out all because Gehazi thought he could get something for nothing, thought he could lie his way into getting some goodies, and it ended up catching him disastrously. Here's the first principle of sin that we always need to remember. Sin has its consequences. The Apostle Paul wrote in Romans chapter 6, the wages of sin is death. We use that verse correctly in trying to show people that if you die in your sin because you've rejected Christ, you are going to die a spiritual death. You're going to be eternally separated. You're going to go to hell, ultimately cast into the lake of fire. But there's also a very practical application of that verse to us as Christian people. There is always a wage to be paid for sin. God is faithful in paying his debts. Because of what God has told us in his word, if we are righteous, he has promised us rewards in heaven, and he will pay on those rewards because he has promised. In that manner, God is a form of a debtor. He's going to make good on his debts. But for those that practice unrighteousness, the wages of sin, being death, being consequences, being punishment, however you want to look at it, that is a biblical principle that we cannot ignore. When you sin willfully against God, when you live a life of disobedience, you have earned something that God has to pay to you. And the problem is, when it comes to sin, you're not going to like what he has to pay you. Now, I'll admit, you read verse 27, the penalty for this, in the grand scheme, because we're human beings, we're kind of jaded, we tend to look at life subjectively. This really wasn't that big of a deal, right? He didn't kill anybody. He didn't rape anybody. He didn't do all these things. All he did was tell a little white lie and got something, that, quite frankly, Naaman wasn't going to miss. Didn't hurt anybody. No harm, no foul. Unfortunately, that's the human attitude that we can look at it with this. God doesn't see sin that way. God decides to punish him by placing the uncleanness of leprosy that Naaman had taken away onto Gehazi for the rest of his life, which, by the way, we don't know how much longer that was. He didn't instantly kill him. You see Gehazi mentioned again in chapter 8, so we know that's written approximately about 3 years or so after these events. He lives at least 3 more years. And it doesn't matter if he lived 3 years or 30 years, he died a leper. He had to live the rest of his life enduring all the physical consequences of leprosy that Brother Joe told you this morning. He had to live the rest of his life with the recognizable shame of the consequences of his decision. And then he also said that it's going to pass down for his seed, to his seed forever. Why did God decide to handle it this way? Simple answer. I have no idea. I have no ability to know why or how or when God is going to decide to judge my sin, give me the consequences that I have earned. I have no way of knowing that. You have no way of knowing that. To be honest with you, I think that's a pretty good thing that we have no way of knowing that. As human beings, here's what I suspect would happen. If we as Christians thought we had the ability to predict how our sins were going to be rewarded or paid back, so to speak, we would probably go through a process at times, or many of us might, or at least be tempted, to go through a process where we weigh the benefits of the pleasure of sin for a season, as Hebrews chapter 11 tells us, versus exactly how bad the consequence is going to be. And if you don't think you might not be tempted to do that, let me just give you an example and just tell you this truth. We do that. Not necessarily with sin, but we do it with other decisions in our lives. Next week, if I decide I'm going to go to the gym and I decide I'm going to try a new exercise, I'm going to go through in my mind the benefits versus the potential consequences. If it comes down to it's going to benefit a certain muscle group, it's going to make me feel better, consequence, I might be sore for a couple days and that's it. Okay, fine, it's worth it. I'm going to go ahead and do it. If, on the other hand, I determine the consequences are that I could pull something, I could tear my rotator cuff again, I could get killed, then I'm going to say, nah, that's okay, it's not worth the risk. You decide to buy a house. Maybe you got a new addition to the family. Maybe the kids are growing up. Maybe you just want to move. So you're buying a house. You look at the costs. You look at the benefits. Benefits, more room, bigger yard, newer, nicer amenities, whatever the situation is. Costs, higher mortgage, possibly higher property taxes, possibly higher utility bills. Then you got to pay for furniture and remodeling. You weigh all of that and you say, yeah, okay, it's worth it. You don't think that we would be tempted to do the same thing as Christians if we actually thought we could predict what the consequences were? Let's say you're a Christian person. You know that the Bible condemns drunkenness. I'm not going to get into any debates about the drinking of alcohol, but we all can agree drunkenness is labeled a sin in the Bible. Don't do it. You're a devout Christian. You don't do what you're not supposed to do. You do what you're supposed to do. Your buddies invite you, buddies from work invite you over to a Super Bowl party, and you go through this process. You go through this analysis. Well, if I go, yeah, I know there's going to be beer, maybe some other alcohol. I'm probably going to get drunk. But what's the consequences of that? First of all, I'm not going to lose my salvation. Second of all, yeah, I might throw up a lot. Might get a hangover for a day or so. A couple days, I'm going to be fine. And if that's worth it to you, it wouldn't be worth it to me. You can keep all that stuff as far as I'm concerned. But you might decide to go ahead and engage in it. But you're missing a few other options here. That's not the only possible consequence. Consequence number one that you're missing out on, you could decide to drive home, get pulled over, and arrested for DUI. Bad option. You might decide to drive home, you might get in a car accident and get killed. Terrible option. You might decide to drive home, get into a car accident involving another car, and somebody else gets killed. Taking away an innocent life, destroying an innocent family, destroying your own life, destroying your own family, felony record, going to prison, the whole 9 yards. Horrible option. Problem is we don't consider the consequences of our sin. And we don't consider the possible options and what all could happen. I understand. John chapter 14, I think it is. Jesus told his disciples, if you love me, keep my commandments. That should be motivation enough to not sin. But let's be honest here. Oftentimes it isn't, because we do all still sin. 1 John chapter 1, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. So obviously it's not just loving God that keeps us out of trouble. If you need an additional motivation to not sin, think about the consequences and just come up with the right answer that, hey, it's probably not worth it. And it's okay, Brother Wally's preached this before, it's okay to do the right thing even if there's a little bit of the wrong reason behind it. It's a lot better to decide not to cheat on your wife because you might get caught as opposed to not cheating on your wife because it's wrong. It's a lot better to not cheat on your wife because you might get caught than to decide to cheat on your wife. I have a feeling, Leviticus chapter 10, if Nadab and Abihu knew that offering strange incense at the altar of God was going to result in fire coming down and turning them into piles of ashes, they probably wouldn't have done it. I have a feeling that if Achan knew that by taking some of the spoils of Jericho would lead to the Israelite army being defeated at Ai and ultimately the death of him and his family, he probably wouldn't have done it. I have a feeling if Ananias and Sapphira knew that if they sold their land and kept back part of the possession and lied about it, lied to the apostles but also the Spirit of God, and they would as a result end up just literally dropping dead, they might not have done it. The bottom line to all of this is sin is nothing to play with. Amen. Don't play with sin because God doesn't play with it. It's too easy to fall into the trap of sin. You never know what the consequence is going to be. I have a feeling Gehazi knew that if he was going to spend the rest of his life as a leper and pass that down to his children and his children's children, I'd like to think he wouldn't have done this either. Don't let one bad decision result in a lifetime of consequence. Brother Joe.